I see a few of you are joining still, but let's get started. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. So first of all, I want to say a massive thank you on behalf of all of us here at Rare and Chester Zoo for taking the time out of your day to join us for this really important conversation. So we're looking forward to having you with us as we kickstart the year with this timely get together, as we reflect on the Global Biodiversity Framework that was agreed in Montreal, and turn to the role that behaviour change can play in successful implementation of the framework. So my name is Sam Gray, and I'm based in Berlin, and I'm working for Rare's Global Development Team. Now, I'll leave my colleague later on to make a full introduction to Rare and the work that we do. But I'm pleased to open the session by introducing our fantastic speakers who are joining us today. So we'll be opening the session today with a presentation from David Ainsworth, who is joining us as the Information Officer and lead for driving forward all of the comms work across the CBD Secretariat. And within that session, David will be looking at the outcomes of the CBD COP in Montreal, while also setting the scene as we now look forward at the pathway to implementation. We'll then be heading over to a talk for Rare's own Kevin Green, who's the Vice President and lead for the Rare's Centre for Behaviour and the Environment. And Kevin's going to look at some of the key principles and ideas that we can refer to when thinking about behaviour change and the role it can play in implementation of the GBF. Following on from Kevin's talk, I'm delighted to welcome Rosina Bierbaum, who amongst her illustrious work achievements will be joining us from her position as the chair of the GEF Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel. Rosina is here to share insights from her work on the STAP, the role that behaviour change plays in the GEF 8, and the role it can play in implementation of the targets within the Global Biodiversity Framework. Our fourth speaker will be Sachez Tirona, who is the global head of Rare's Fish Forever programme. So Rocky is here to share insights on where behaviour change has been embedded into the national strategies in the Philippines and also the work of Rare's Fish Forever programme. And finally, I'm pleased to welcome Charlotte Smith. So Charlotte works as the Director of Conservation Education at Chester Zoo and is here to share some examples of behaviour change in action, looking at the great work of Chester Zoo's Sustainable Palm Oil campaign as an example. And one thing to note as well, at the end of today's session, we set aside some time for a short panel discussion, which will be a good chance to give our speakers the opportunity to answer as many questions as possible that can be put to them by you. So to chair that session, we'll be joined by Salman Dowd, who's the Science Director at Chester Zoo. And as such, throughout the webinar, you'll be able to see that we've left both the chat function open and also the Q&A function. So one thing I'd encourage you to do, if you've got a question that comes to mind that you'd like to put to our speakers, do be sure to put that in the Q&A function, just because it will make it much easier for us to kind of track those questions when it comes to the end of the session. So considering we've got so much to get to, without further ado, let me hand over to a face that I'm sure will be very familiar to many of you that were closely following the CBD COP proceedings, either in Montreal or in the long process to get us there. So over to you, David.
Great, thank you very much, Sam. Give me just a moment here to activate my slides. It really is quite a pleasure to be here, to be invited. I've done, a great deal of work with the folks here at Rare, and indeed, it has been a pleasure to work with all of you over the next little while to move forward and get such great attention and strong results for this Global Biodiversity Framework. So, pardon me as I just get my slides ready. It's funny, after all this time during the pandemic, you would think that I would be able to have all of my technology ready right away. There we go, good. Great, there we go. So I'm really honored to have this chance to be with you all today to speak about the outcomes of the recent biodiversity conference in Montreal. As we know, this is the headlines that were at the end of December. The second half of COP15, which is what we held here in Montreal, culminated in a historic milestone for the convention as well as the global biodiversity agenda globally. And so on December the 19th, parties adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. It's important to note that in addition to the framework, parties also adopted other decisions that complemented the framework. These decisions relate to financial resources, capacity building, technology transfer, a monitoring framework that complements the Global Biodiversity Framework, and also on digital sequence information for genetic resources. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework builds on the strategic plan for biodiversity that took place the last decade. It builds on the achievements of that time, also on the gaps and the lessons learned. And it looks also at the experience and achievements of other relevant international and multilateral environment agreements. And what this thing does is it sets out an ambitious plan to implement broad-based action. And the point is to bring about a transformation in our society's relationship with biodiversity. Certainly by 2030, in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals, and also to ensure that by 2050, the shared vision of living in harmony with nature is fulfilled. The Kunming Biodiversity Framework aims to catalyze, enable, and galvanize urgent and transformative action by governments, but also by subnational and local authorities with the involvement of everyone, all of society. The goal is to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to achieve the outcomes that are set out in the vision, mission, goals, and targets of the framework. And thereby, overall, the idea is to contribute to the three objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this is conservation, sustainable use of biodiversity, and also the equitable sharing of benefits from its use. And the whole idea is to make sure that we're implementing all of these objectives with the Convention in a balanced manner, even as we move forward on this global biodiversity framework. Now, so the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework outlines 4 ambitious long-term goals that are to take us to the middle of the century, and also 23 actionable targets that need to be achieved by the end of this decade. So these goals and targets are sent to guide global actions from now, so starting even today, through 2030, to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to facilitate and further contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and to put us on a path to recover and meet the 2050 vision, which is of living in harmony with nature. So there are 4 overarching goals that we look in the convention, and let me just give you a sense what some of them are. First of all, there's one goal which addresses the need to maintain, enhance, and restore the integrity, connectivity, and resilience of all ecosystems. This goal also looks to halt human-induced extinction of known threatened species. It's also meant to reduce the extinction rate and risk that's posed to all species, and then also to look at maintaining the genetic diversity within populations of wild and domesticated species. So you can see that this goal is really the conservation, to improve the status of biodiversity overall. The second goal is one that focuses on the sustainable use of biodiversity. And in this case, looking at the value of nature's contributions to people. This one seeks to support the achievement of sustainable development for the present, for the benefit of present and future generations. And so this particular goal really is about sustainable use. It's about the way that we are engaging with biodiversity in a sustainable manner. The third goal addresses the importance of ensuring that the benefits that arise from the utilization of genetic resources, including digital sequence information and also traditional knowledge that's associated with genetic resources, that all of this is shared fairly and equitably. Now, that's the third objective of the convention, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits of resources. It's important to note that as we move forward on this goal, we're seeking to ensure that traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources is also appropriately protected. And then finally, the fourth goal we're looking at is one that focuses on the means of implementation. And this is particularly interesting and important for the framework because previous plans didn't really have this sort of focus on how we were achieving implementation. So this focus on the means of implementation helps us to ensure that the means are equally accessible to all parties, developed and developing, and also that these resources are progressively closing the biodiversity finance gap, an important part of it, making sure this finance gap has moved forward. The idea is also to see that all international finance flows are aligned with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and the 2030 vision for biodiversity. So that means of implementation focuses very, very heavily on the question of finance. And we know we've got more discussions coming up this year within the Global Environment Facility about how we're going to move forward on that biodiversity trust fund as well. Now, let me just have a quick review of some of the 23 targets that we're looking at within the framework. And so these are split into 3 different categories. And so the first category looks at targets 1 through 8. And again, it looks at some of these conservation matters, but it really is looking at reducing threats to biodiversity. So how do we reduce these pressures that are putting biodiversity? And so the topics that are looked at here include questions of spatial planning, which is biodiversity inclusive, because a lot of spatial planning to date doesn't guarantee that it's got all of the matters of biodiversity included in it. Second of all, there's a target that deals with restoration. You know, we're in the middle of the United Nations Decade for Ecological Restoration, and restoration is an important part of our framework for allow us to move and reduce these threats. The third one is the famous 30 by 30, which is protected areas, but also not just traditional protected areas, but also looking at other effective area-based conservation measures. This is important because it opens up the doors for a variety of forms of conservation that involve Indigenous peoples and local communities and other groups in society that can move forward with it. There's a target on threatened species in particular. I notice we have someone from the Reverse the Red who's on our call today, and they can maybe talk about a little bit of some of that work they're doing there. There's also important work on the harvesting and trade in wild species in this area as well. An important part of sustainable use of wild species that's already moving forward in the convention. There's a target that deals with invasives, a target that deals with pollution. The pollution target under the framework is quite interesting. Previously under the convention, pollution really dealt with questions of nitrogen fixation, maybe a bit of phosphorus. But now this pollution target also deals with questions of fertilizers, pesticides, and also has a linkage with the plastics agenda as well. And so this pollution target is much more extensive. And then finally, under this category, we also have a target that deals with climate change and ocean acidification. The second category looks at targets 8 through 13. And this one is really a focus on what we call the tools, focus on meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. This is important, meeting people's needs. So this target addresses topics such as the management and use of wild species, relating to the sustainable use that I talked about in the first one, but again, it's really about communities and their management practices. The target also addresses agriculture, aquaculture, fisheries and forestry, an important part of mainstreaming biodiversity into the work of all those sectors. It has a target that looks at ecosystem functions and services. There's a target relating green and blue spaces in urban and densely populated areas, which is interesting. It means that we're now looking at how biodiversity is featured and managed and integrated into urban spaces. And then finally, there's a target that deals with the third objective of the convention, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits that arise from the utilization of genetic resources. And then finally, the third and last category is these targets 14 through 23. And this is really about implementation and mainstreaming. It's an extensive list you see on the screen here, so maybe I won't actually read through all of these as well, but I think it's important to note that these targets look at the ways that we can ensure that we're mainstreaming biodiversity across the sectors of society in areas that it's not typically thought of. We're also looking in this case about business. There's an important way of looking at how businesses incorporate biodiversity into their work. There's work on overconsumption as well. So in fact, this is one of the areas we'd probably talk about with regard to behavior change as well. How can we look at the management of sustainable consumption and as well? But these targets provide us the background to really help make changes in our behaviors that might not have happened under previous work as well. So it is indeed a very comprehensive and well thought out framework, and it's very impressive that governments came to agree on all of these elements for it as well. So now, looking ahead, there's several steps that are needed to implement the framework. So the first thing is that we need to build capacity at all levels. We've got to facilitate effective implementation of the framework in this way. This includes training and technical assistance. In some ways, some of the work that we're going to talk about today will be related to that. The next one, incredibly important, is the engagement with a wide range of stakeholders. It includes all levels of government, but it includes civil society, the private sector, Indigenous peoples and local communities. And we're trying to ensure that the framework is effectively implemented through really concerted efforts, but also the question of inclusion and equity is an important part. And the other part is that we'll be strengthening and monitoring and reporting mechanisms that track progress and encourage transparency and accountability. Those mechanisms weren't particularly strong in the previous plan, and this is an important part now. So, and then also providing support to developing countries so that they can carry out all of these parts of the framework as well. It's important to have the mainstreaming of biodiversity is for this as well. I've talked a little bit about that before, but mainstreaming needs to look at a lot of different sectors, the health sector, for example, tourism, infrastructure work, mining, etc. We need to look at information sharing, making sure that we're really transforming the way that we share and generate knowledge. Again, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. The respect of human rights, with a lot of the recent decisions about human rights to a clean environment, we're looking at that. But the other important part is, as we move forward on this, are we ensuring that we are respecting the human rights around the world, and so that conservation outcomes don't take away the rights from, say, Indigenous peoples and local communities. In that regard, too, the social notion that the framework will work on free and prior informed consent of different communities is very key, so that when we engage with communities around the world, it's in an open and informed way. And then finally, we also make sure that as we engage and mobilize traditional knowledge, that it's used appropriately, and that the rights, the wishes of Indigenous peoples and local communities are taken into account. The final thing I'll cover on, I hope I'm not taking too long, is I think it's important to look at Section K of the framework. So for Section K deals with communication, education, awareness, and uptake. The chapeau paragraph of this crucial section is quoted here, and it says that enhancing communication, education, and awareness on biodiversity and the uptake of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework by everyone is essential to achieve its effective implementation and behavioral change, promoting sustainable lifestyles and biodiversity values. And so this important part of it is a really key area of the work that we're going to be doing then. The text for this paragraph then points out a variety of different areas where we need to increase awareness, but with the goal of bringing about action and transformational change, including behavioral change. And you see a number of these different areas here. I'll share the presentation so you can look at those, but this is copied pretty much verbatim from Section K of the framework, so I'd invite you to take a look at that yourselves. So I think one can say that the task of negotiating and adopting the framework is accomplished, and that's probably the easier of the tasks as well. The most difficult and challenging task lays ahead of us, and that ensures that we concretely take the measures and actions to work together and implement this framework as well. So that's how we can make a real difference. So I'm hoping in our discussions today, we can look at some of the directions people intend to move forward on, and then unpack some of these other areas. So thank you, Sam, for giving me the space to speak. Thank you to everyone for listening. And I'm looking forward to the conversation and discussions that we'll have later on. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, David. Thanks for joining us. And I hope you've also had some time now to recharge after what must have been a very busy end to 2022. So yeah, moving on from David's talk, I'm now happy to introduce you to RARE's Kevin Green, who, as I mentioned at the start, leads up our Centre for Behaviour and the Environment. And Kevin's going to take a little bit more now of a deeper focus onto the role that behaviour change can play. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, David. I'm really grateful to be here with this illustrious panel and with this incredible group of participants. Just looking at the chat where everyone's coming from, it's really exciting to have this group gathered. So I think on behalf of the whole panel, I want to encourage everyone to continue to use the chat and the Q&A to share ideas and questions and comments and make the most out of this pretty amazing group that we've got assembled here. So in that spirit, if you're joining us today, I'm assuming that you already have some interest in how behavior change can help advance your work. To get a sense of where everyone is at in their organizations, one question that we'd like to ask before we begin is, how do you think behavioral sciences are perceived in your organization? And we're going to launch a poll here that you can respond to. So your choices are behavioral science isn't yet seriously considered, and I want to change that. We're at the early stages, or maybe we've begun to apply insights from behavioral science, but we can be even better. Behavioral science is already strongly integrated, or it could be, wait, what's behavioral science? So take a moment to chime in quickly with your response to this question, and we will share results shortly. Okay, let's see how we're doing. I'm not sure if we can share, we can show the responses. All right, pretty mixed, pretty well distributed, which is great. That means we've got a wide range of perspectives and experiences across the board on folks just curious, interested in learning, interested in being innovators or early adopters in their organizations, to some folks with much more experience, perhaps to share with the rest of us. So that's great. That's a great baseline. Please continue to bring those perspectives to the discussion. All right, let me set some context on RARE. RARE's mission is to inspire change so people and nature thrive. To do that, we've run somewhere around 500 behavior change campaigns alongside partners in more than 60 countries all around the world. And on average, those campaigns have increased adoption of target sustainable behaviors by about 18 percentage points in just 2 years' time. And even more importantly, they've taught us what works and what doesn't in inspiring and enabling people to change. So with that experience in hand, just a few years ago, we launched the Center for Behavior and the Environment to conduct and translate research and to equip the entire conservation field with the science and tools of behavior change. So what does that mean in practice for biodiversity conservation? Well, virtually all the global drivers of biodiversity loss, including overfishing, food waste, deforestation, agricultural expansion, pollution, wildlife trade, invasive species, you name it, they all share at least one thing in common, which is to solve them, someone is going to have to decide to change something they're doing. Well, how do people decide what to do? Turns out people are complicated. We have a wide spectrum of ways in which we process information and make decisions, ranging from the really thoughtful and deliberate to the very quick and reactive, and everything in between. And it's very tempting to assume that our decisions are mostly made on this side of the spectrum, on the left side. So tempting, in fact, that in the environmental field, our most common strategies are designed specifically for this type of thinking. If we want someone to change, we can pay them, thus changing the material incentives associated with the costs and benefits of a particular decision. We can tell them by making them more informed in their decision-making, or we can stop them or force them to start by changing the rules. And these make up what we at RARE usually call the traditional levers of change. And to be sure, these can be very effective and useful under the right circumstances. But they also ignore or at least underappreciate some aspects of our behavior and decision-making that are maybe less obvious, but have become more understood as the behavioral and social sciences have expanded over the last couple of decades. This includes, that emotions are often more powerful than reason, or at least respond more quickly, that we are an inherently social species that likes to cooperate, that cares about our reputation and the like, and finally, that the context and timing of when and where we make decisions really matters, often as much as or more than the actual choices that we have. And so, armed with that deeper level of understanding of behavior and decision making, of what makes people tick, we can expand the levers that we have at our disposal that we're able to pull on in various ways to encourage, inspire, and really enable adoption of the appropriate behaviors to enable people and nature to thrive. So that now, in addition to, not instead of material incentives, information and rules and regulations, we can also use emotional appeals, social influences, and choice architecture, which means the design of the decision-making context, to change behaviors. So now, as of last month, we have our Global Biodiversity Framework, a big challenge that will only be possible with changes in behavior at all levels. which we're here to talk about. So this has already been recognized, by the way, in IUCN Motion 64, which is focused on promoting conservation through behavior-centered solutions. This is a motion that Rare co-led with the Chester Zoo, and it explicitly recognizes that advances in the field of behavioral science can aid in designing effective conservation solutions and policies. And the motion also highlighted that behaviorally informed solutions should be used across all conservation efforts, which is really important clarification to make, from work with natural resource users to corporate actors and supply chain managers, consumers demanding unsustainable or sustainable products, civic and public institutions, you name it. And so, just a few minutes ago, we encouraged you to share through the chat box which targets you were following more closely during the COP proceedings. And while I don't think we have time really to take a deep dive into each individual target, we got a great summary from David, and I think it's clear that it's integral to all of them. So it's exciting to talk today with our illustrious panelists about why behavior change is key to implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and how it has been and can be included in approaches to protect biodiversity. So a lot of great examples of how these levers of behavior change can support conservation were actually highlighted in a literature review that we at the Center for Behavior and the Environment worked on in partnership with the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel of the GEF back in 2020. And a full chapter was specifically related to this. So we'll put a link to that lit review in the chat box and in follow-up. But let me just give you a couple quick examples. One great example comes from the Health and Harmony Initiative delivered in Indonesia, which was looking to address both the cause of logging and to find ways to replace the behavior permanently. And by the kind of key insight here is by consulting communities directly to find out what they really needed to protect the forests of the national park. Health and Harmony recognized that the real cause of illegal logging, or one primary driver of illegal logging, was the high cost of healthcare for villagers. So instead of providing extra cash, the initiative provided villagers with affordable healthcare. And over 13 years, it led to a 90% decrease in logging, a 67% decrease in infant mortality, and upwards of 50,000 acres of forest regeneration, which was only possible through a very sort of people-centered approach. Another example is in Namibia, the Rhino Rangers program, which highlights how a community can directly benefit from conservation efforts and use those benefits to establish new patterns of behavior. So this program supported communities in choosing rhino custodians from within their communities, and then training and equipping them as rangers to lead rhino monitoring, which then became really high social status positions, so that over a few years, the number of rhino rangers really skyrocketed and set rhino sightings to a record high. And in just 5 years, poaching declined by 83%. So that's just a taste of the kind of stories that you can find, these people-centered solutions to protecting biodiversity in that lit review and elsewhere. So with that, it's my pleasure now to hand it over directly and introduce our next speaker, chair of the Science and Technical Advisory Panel of the GEF, Dr. Rosina Bierbaum, who, in addition to in her role with the GEF staff, is also Dean Emerita of the University of Michigan's School of Natural Resources and Environment. She's the Weston Chair in Natural Economics at the University of Maryland, and has lots of experience in both the legislative and executive branches of the U.S. government as well, where, for example, she ran the first environment division of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So we are in the best possible company here, and we should all listen closely. So thanks a lot, Rosina, and over to you. Let me just stop sharing my screen here for you.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. That was an amazing introduction. I hope I can live up to it. I'm really happy to be here with you today. And I know that David thought his IT capabilities were not good, but I'm hoping that you can actually now see my slide. Could you confirm that, Kevin?
Yes, all good.
Excellent. So as you heard, I'm going to share work on what the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel, or STAP, has done for the Global Environment Facility, or GEF. STAP is an independent, small but eager advisory team of scientists, and the role is to help GEF in two ways: to bring science to the GEF and to bring GEF science needs back out to the broader scientific community. The importance and the recognition of behavioral change needs has really become more central to the GEF in just the last few years as necessary to implement their mission, which is implement the environmental treaties and maximize global environmental benefits. And I will also come back and touch briefly on how behavioral change can support the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Behavioral change has many entry points, many facets, and many dimensions, even more than the colors of this wonderful EMN chameleon. So how did this all start? Well, at the request, as you heard, of our governing board in 2020, that's the GEF Council of Countries, we sought to strengthen our efforts to incorporate social science, because it's central to helping the GEF achieve its goal of transformational change, and quickly. So we commissioned, as you heard, RARE to synthesize the literature on behavioral science to specifically help us understand how stakeholders' motivations, their values, and their needs can enhance the design and implementation of interventions to be more durable. And that work built on a lot of previous STAP work where we had talked about enabling elements of good project design, including how to build a theory of change, how to do appropriate multi-stakeholder dialogue, nature-based solutions, and how to mainstream them. And of course, as you know, the literature documents that culture and behavior are hard to change. Here are some of our close relatives engaged in palm-to-palm clasping, which is passed down in matrilineal lines. And that's a behavior that may be as hard for them to change as indeed handshakes were were to abandon during the COVID times. You may wonder why behavioral change is so critical to the GEF, and really from STAP's review of hundreds of projects, we know that there is almost always a GEF project outcome that implicitly is associated with behavioral change among the target stakeholder groups. They must make a change and they have to buy into that change to achieve the project outcomes. And of course, that requires multi-stakeholder dialogue from the top down and the bottom up to understand the social and cultural context in order to reverse environmental degradation with actions that will work and that are wanted by the community. Building that kind of trust and legitimacy requires time. It's not a one-step process, and it can't be done in a very short 1 to 2 year time frame. When STAP did a deeper review of a subset of the GEF projects, we discovered that many of them assumed behavior change at different levels, either at the individual level, so a small farmer adopts climate smart agriculture, or whole groups such as the ranchers or the soy producers embrace sustainability, or change at an institutional level, for example, policies and government agencies. However, this was invariably implicit, not often stated as an explicit project objective. And as the cartoon on the right shows, an important middle step needs to be spelled out. The outcome sought was clear, as was whose behavior needed to change, but how this was to be achieved was not explained. And that how bit, the miracle in the middle, was usually missing. So investments are more likely to succeed if the assumed behavioral change is spelled out explicitly rather than it's just a background assumption or an expectation. And as you heard, RARE discusses 6 behavioral change levers, 3 of those used more traditionally: material incentives, rules and regulations, and information. But the other 3 are also important. the choice architecture or context, emotional appeals, and social influences. So these 6 levers need to be appropriately recognized, to be mixed, and to be matched to effect significant environmental change and improvement. And an additional point that I think we need to increasingly recognize is that projects need to be designed now for resilience to a suite of future impacts. And changing behaviors can help manage risk, and they can be a key part of adaptive management. That is, allowing for flexibility and responsiveness to learning during implementation of new innovations. Durable behavioral change and intentional multi-stakeholder dialogue are really inherently linked. To create that lasting change, you must have buy-in, the interventions that fit the needs of the varying groups of stakeholders, and is sensitive to their cultural and their social norms. So our advice to the GEF after RARE's analysis in 2020, we provided a checklist of questions that we think can really help project developers identify and address behavioral change explicitly in designing projects rather than implicitly. So here are the 6 issues, and under them in our report, we have supporting questions. But basically, whose behavior needs to change? You better think that through and integrate it throughout the theory of change. Who, therefore, needs to be involved and at what points? And importantly in there, who can enable or limit behavioral change? Third, what are the barriers or what are the enablers of behavioral change? And this is really applying a systems thinking to incorporate those barriers or enablers into the project rationale, design, planning, implementation. Fourth, choose multiple levers. We already talked about the 6 levers, and thinking about mixing and matching those are important. Fifth, what changes need to be monitored so you know if you're succeeding or not, and what learning can help achieve the desired objective. You definitely want robust monitoring, evaluation, and learning that's informed over the implementation process to glean the best and the worst practices. And then 6, identify opportunities to challenge established behaviors and create new ways to scale, to innovate, to have durable outcomes and move us towards sustainability. The STAP subsequently in 2022 codified the role of behavioral change as one of those key enabling elements that I mentioned formerly as needed for good project design to be transformational. And you see there it is, along with other puzzle pieces that we think together make a good envelope within which to work. Theory of change, multi-stakeholder dialogue, knowledge management, integration, innovation, considering multiple possible futures, and focus on scalability. So did STAP's work have any impact? Well, yes, it did. This is just a snapshot of a rather complex theory of change for all of the GEF 8 period, the 4-year period we just started. And its purpose in blue is to address the planet in peril by tackling drivers, to get to the right systems transformation. And you see that one of the number of cross-cutting themes that will be deeply integrated is behavioral change, the one circled in red. And the focus here will be on explicitly identifying whose behavior needs to change and how that change is to be achieved as part of an overall approach to design and implementation. But let me get a little bit deeper into it. Jeff's programming document makes that theory of change involving behavioral change more tangible. So just to give you an example, they have 11 big integrated projects that are going to start up, and each of those will have many, they're called programs, and each of those will have many projects under them. And those integrated programs, or IPs, will be about 1/3 of the money that Jeff spends in the coming 4 years. Well, here are 4 of them. Let me start with Wildlife Conservation for Development. This program will focus on behavior change for reducing consumer demand for illegal or unsustainable wildlife, and not just on supply. In the description of eliminating hazardous chemicals from supply chain, that will focus on behavioral change and circular approaches in supply chains in two very different places, fashion and construction, but where reducing resource intensity is important and requires behavioral change. Two other examples in the Sustainable Cities IP, they will integrate resource efficiency and behavioral change in infrastructure planning. And so that means everything from transport to energy, to buildings, to waste. And the fourth one, circular solutions to plastic pollution, will focus on upstream and downstream actions by addressing the entire value chain, including shifting behavior for plastics and fostering markets for recycling non-toxic materials. So the framework for these 4 and the other 7 IPs will be developed in the next 6 months, and all the projects that will fall under them will be designed over the next 1.5 years. So there's going to be ample opportunity to have behavioral science incorporated into the program and the project design, and we hope that they will be using STAP's checklist, for example. And so I promised I would get on to behavioral change in the Global Biodiversity Framework. Biodiversity is obviously an issue front and center in the Jeff's priorities. Coming back to where David spoke, looking just at goal B, you see that on this slide, clearly there are several entry points for behavioral change. I mean, this wonderfully lofty goal cannot be achieved without behavioral change. Sustainable use, management, valuing ecosystem services, restoration, sustainable development. These require embracing the values, the norms, the cultural aspects of key actors, including Indigenous people, women, and youth, to understand whose behavior needs to change, why, and how. It requires acting on opportunities for deep collaboration, building trust and legitimacy between key actors during the design and implementation of biodiversity activities. It means explicitly addressing barriers to transformative change and to durable outcomes, and identifying those possible levers to change behavior. And if they don't work, understanding why not. Are social norms being challenged? Are there enough reinforcing policies or incentives supporting it? The essential point is that interventions are more likely to be successful if individual, societal, and institutional support are aligned top-down and bottom-up. What we do know about the scientific underpinning of behavior holds great promise for helping to achieve the 23 targets David discussed. And so if you just look at the first 3, which are halt biodiversity loss, restore 30% of degraded ecosystems, and have 30% of land and sea under effective conservation and management. To achieve that in the next urgent 7 years, the process will need to have a clear theory of change that includes defining the who, the what, and the how of behavioral change. Who to engage, what changes, such as improved livelihoods or improved health, are needed, and how to engage the right stakeholders from design through implementation. Barriers as well as enablers of behavioral change need to be understood and addressed along the way. So using spatial planning or other integrated approaches can help define what are the activities, outputs, outcomes necessary and sufficient to achieve these goals. But all during the process of implementation, we must identify, test, and learn from the assumptions made. Did you reach the right stakeholders? Did you incorporate their belief and cultural norms? Did you address explicitly gender, Indigenous knowledge, and power dynamics? Did you build the capacity of communities and civil society to build on and maintain durable change? Are government policies coherent and supporting? So we are seeking transformational change in very little time. It's not possible without achieving equitable governance of protected areas and buy-in of all stakeholders. So being explicit about the who, what, and how of behavioral change must be incorporated right from the beginning in the project design, all through implementation, rather than assumed as an identified solution is one that might be wanted and accepted. So I want to end with 4 key assumptions of the GBF. Biodiversity is rooted in human behavior. So it's not just a technical or science issue, it's a social and cultural one. That includes, as you heard, Section K in the GBF Annex indicates raising awareness and education on sustainable production and consumption, circular economy, the value of nature to human health and livelihoods, and demonstrating how management can be more sustainable. And very importantly, it must include the participation of local communities, women, civil societies, youth, and indigenous people in decision-making, use of traditional knowledge, and respect for rights. So I hope you can see on this slide the eyes of the soulfish on its camouflage body. We must make intended behavioral change less muted, less camouflaged, and more visible and central to achieve the goals of the GBF. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Rosina. Thank you so much for that. I think there's a lot there for us all to go away and reflect on and think about. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us today for that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our next speaker, Rocky Sachez Tirona. And Rocky, thank you so much for joining us and staying up so late. As I'm aware now, it's very well into your evening time. So I want to thank you for that. So as mentioned at the start, Rocky is leading up RARE's Fish Forever program and is based in the Philippines. And before I hand over to Rocky, just a quick reminder as well that we do have the question and answer function available. So if you've got questions that you might like to put to any of our panelists later, do type them into there and we'll try and tackle as many as we can. So over to you, Rocky.
Thank you, Sam. Hello, everyone. Let me do my portion of the technical challenge, and please let me know if you're seeing my screen. Yes, we're good. Okay, so we heard about the big picture, and Kevin shared a lot of how RARE thinks about behavior change. I'd like to spend my time kind of sharing a little bit of the insights of how we've been applying behavior change within Fish Forever, which is our program. So at RARE, and like many of the conservation community, we're thrilled at the passage of the Global Biodiversity Framework, in particular for Fish Forever and for people that think about behavior change quite often. We're particularly focused on targets 3, 8, 9, 20, and 21, where we really see the intersections between people, biodiversity, and climate change. Here in the Philippines, we have actually been working with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources since 2016 and since 2013. And when they passed their flagship Coastal and Marine Ecosystems program called CMEP, they already embedded behavior change as one of the key approaches or pillars of the program. And so we've been very lucky to have been working with the DNR to really train their protected area managers at the national level to design and develop behavior campaigns for the different national protected areas in the country. And these are some of them. In Fish Forever, we have been working and focused on 4 specific behaviors to really succeed at protecting and conserving the coastal and marine resources in a community. We believe that fishers need to participate in the process, and this is something that has been mentioned earlier about really being tied to decision making. And this is critical to establishing the right frameworks for management moving forward. Also, in order to manage the fisheries, fishers also really need to register as fishers. That way we know who's fishing in an area, and therefore we're able to manage the effort that's going into it. Another big component is really about respecting and complying with fishing rules and regulations. So very often this is about no-take zones, and then using the right gears. And this is also very, very critical to sustainable use of resources. Finally, the 4th behavior that we ask fishers to adopt is really about reporting their catch. So again, this is in order to provide data, in order to ensure that there are tools for decision making that the management bodies can use. So these 4 behaviors all need to be in place in order for successful management of coastal fisheries to take place. But it's not easy to do this. And we recognize that this is all intertwined. And if you really think about it, fishing is really a cooperative behavior. It's one where the individuals have to take on personal costs for the benefit of the whole group. And it's not something that you do just for yourself. And we've formulated a theory of cooperative behavior together with the Center for Behavior and the Environment that really thinks through how people think about how others are perceiving a behavior, what they're thinking and what their beliefs are, and then whether they believe that others are also changing, and then later on when they've adopted the behavior, whether others are doing it as well. So there's always that sense of, I can't be doing this alone. And so with that, we've really tried to incorporate the behavior levers that Kevin talked about earlier into this shifting phases of cooperative behavior. So let me show you what that looks like in Fish Forever. So in phase 1, it's really about generating the collective demand. This is where we want to see that the community, as particularly the fishers, are really recognizing that there is a problem and that this is a problem that they all share. And then we want to be able to make sure that they're seeing that others are also going through this process of realization. And so that they all start to believe that others might also change. And that's really important. So we do this really through a lot of different activities where we use the different behavior levers like information, emotional appeals, and social influences. We conduct community discussions where people are also see that others are also learning. In these images here, you'll see the communities playing a fishing game where they see how others are behaving when it's open access, and then when there's a protected area that's been established, and who violates the rules, etc. So articulating the beliefs and the changes in the attitudes that they're having, and then seeing others going through the same process makes them start to think that, okay, I'm not the only one who's going to be making the change. And that's really, really important. They go through reserve workshops where they are deciding where no-take reserves ought to be, but at the same time, they're also deciding that in the areas where they do get to fish, what the kinds of rules are, who gets to fish in there, what kind of gear are they going to use, and so on. So going through that process together also helps cement that process of making the shift. I think here another thing worth pointing out is that in the invitations to attend the workshops, the materials emphasize that the community members or the fishers are actually seen as the experts, and they have to come to the meetings to really bring their perspective. And again, that's another way to influence how they're going to behave. And then in this next phase, it's really about coordinating the shift. It's really signaling to others that the shift is starting to take place. And then we work on really making sure that there are public expressions of this intent to cooperate. We also provide information, and it's also about increasing observability of the behavior. So here, there's a lot of material that really provides information, shares the rules and regulations. You see, you have to be very clear about what needs to happen and who needs to do it and how. But at the same time, there's other levers at work here. So these are what we call the public signals of change. So for example, boats are color-coded and marker buoys are set up around no-take zones. That way, people can see who's complying with the rules and who's violating it, because the wrong color boat in the wrong area tells you that something isn't, that person is violating the rules. On the positive side, IDs and other things like T-shirts, for example, are ways that fishers can demonstrate that they are complying with the desired behaviors by having an official signal that they're doing this, and that's a way to kind of like illustrate how the social influences are at work. Another big important piece in this portion is having public commitments by officials to increase their accountability. So we have things like murals, pledges being signed by officials. And this not only increases their accountability, but it also tells the community that they're not the only ones doing this. And again, that it's a whole community that's making the shift. And here we see things like the emotional appeals of pride and then the influences the social influence that is exerted by people who are in authority. And then in the last phase, this is really about strengthening that new norm. So as people have made the shift, now you want to reward that shift in behavior by having rewards and recognition programs. Here we talk about Profi, who in the Philippines, that's shortcut for the professional fisher. So it's a source of pride for the fisher that gets the award that kind of acknowledges that he is doing the right thing and is really behaving in a professional manner. So that's one way of strengthening the new norms. So just for a quick deep dive, I want to talk a little bit about how this all played out in Honduras. As they launched a campaign to really respect the rules and regulations in the no-take reserves. So this happened in Santa Fe on the Caribbean coast in Honduras, across 30 communities in one municipality. And here the audience were really the fishers, and the intent of the campaign was really to increase their knowledge and awareness about the importance and benefits of the no-take reserve. And then at the same time, improve the attitudes towards respecting the no-take boundaries, and then making sure that they only fish outside of the no-take reserve area. And so other than the fishers, there were other stakeholders like community members, the youth and children, and the local government. And so in promoting the concept of the no-take reserves, they played games and events to highlight the no-take zones. There was a collective pledge to respect the rules and regulations, and then they set up buoys to demarcate the no-take zone limits. And so these were they used a range of behavior levers to make this happen, including movie screenings, fish cards for the discussions, learning exchanges between mayors also helped validate the mayors in that they were doing the right thing in enforcing the rules. And then, so the results were really an increase in the awareness and importance of the MPA for fisheries, for food security, and for biodiversity, increased awareness about the boundaries, pride in Cayo Blanco, and then compliance with the rules of the no-take reserve. So that's one kind of concrete example of how behavior change can be integrated across different elements of the program. So to close with, I think, it's just kind of like really helpful to just remind ourselves that when you're talking about biodiversity and people, behavior change really is essential. And that's really what we're going to need in order to see the Global Biodiversity Framework succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Rocky. Thank you very much. So that now leaves me to hand over to our final speaker, which, as mentioned, is Charlotte Smith, who's joining us from Chester Zoo and is also going to be focusing on more examples of behaviour change in action.
Thank you very much. And it's great to see so many people here today interested in behaviour change and the Global Biodiversity Framework. Just get this. Set up. So yeah, my name's Charlotte. I'm Director of Conservation Education at Chester Zoo and very much involved in our behaviour change work that I'll be talking about today, along with many colleagues at the zoo. We're also delighted to be co-hosting today and have worked with RARE on the IUCN Resolution 64, which also focuses on behaviour-centred design in achieving conservation. So Chester Zoo, we're a conservation-based organisation based at our zoo site in Chester, where we care for a collection of around 550 animal species and 2,000 plant species. But a lot of our work involves working with people. We host around 2 million visitors a year and many more through our education programmes, digital programmes and working with people as members of the zoo. We also work around the world on conservation projects in 21 countries, many of these rooted in behaviour change. In 2021, we launched our 10-year conservation master plan, building on decades of work previously to really draw together our vision for conservation in the future around 6 targets and 4 key areas: populations, places, people and policy. And many of these are underpinned by behavioural science, not just our target to empower 10 million people to live more sustainably, but actually all of them, whether we're working to conserve the landscape or to reverse declines of populations, there are always people involved. I think as earlier speakers outlined, many of the threats that those populations and places face those threats because of actions that people are taking. And one of the things I really want to because behavioural science isn't separate from the day-to-day operations of what we do. It's very much integrated into the work across the organisation. In fact, we're going through a process of really mapping how behavioural science can help us maximise all the opportunities that we have. So I thought I'd start with this diagram from the 2015 World Zoo and Aquarium Conservation Strategy, illustrating some of the influence that zoos have. At Chester Zoo, starting with the bottom of this spiral shape, our staff and governing authorities are over 1,000 people. As I mentioned, we have 2 million visitors each year and work with many more in our digital programmes. Over 100 million people engagements on our social media channels. We also work with a vast range of suppliers, around 1,200 in a year, as well as politicians and others through our political engagements. And this can be scaled up across zoos around the world. This same strategy noted around 700 million visits to zoos each year. So there's lots of potential for us to really leverage that public reach, that buying power and our influence to drive change towards the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I wanted to share today an example of just one of the projects that we've been working on for some time that feels relevant here. And that's particularly our work around to conserve the biodiversity of Southeast Asian islands, particularly orangutans. At the zoo, we're involved in the conservation breeding of orangutans, sun bears, Sumatran tigers and hornbills. And having those species at the zoo gives us a great opportunity to foster emotional connections with them for our visitors. And we're also working with partners on the ground in Malaysia and Borneo, where we support reforestation, education and scientific study. And that gives us a really direct understanding of what those threats to biodiversity are and what needs to happen. And our theory of change and our work with our partners has particularly identified one of the 3 key threats to them being the unsustainable production of palm oil. Many of you might be familiar with the negative impacts of palm oil, which can be a major threat to orangutans, as well as being a social justice issue. And it's devastating populations. So working with partners and internal policy experts, we've identified a key focus for our behaviour change work in this area to drive demand for certified sustainable palm oil, mitigating many of these negative impacts of habitat fragmentation, forest fires, deforestation, climate change, pollution, and the negative social impacts. So we advocate for sustainable palm oil, where there's no deforestation, no fires, no planting on peat, and where there are wildlife corridors and human rights are respected. And our aim with our campaign is to drive demand for sustainable palm oil and to drive change in the palm oil industry so that it becomes more sustainable. In common with many other conservation organisations, our approach is to work with the palm oil industry, driving change for the better, rather than to boycott or drive demand for less efficient oils that might require more land. And using that reach that we have, we're able to work across a wide range of the palm oil supply chain. So our work is multifaceted, involving staff from across the organisation, policy experts, educators, our retail buyers, procurement specialists and social scientists. And we can therefore apply different levers and behaviour change approaches to different parts of this chain. We do make use of traditional levers, particularly in our policy work. Our aim is really to create the rules and regulations that would see change for the industry and outlaw some of the unsustainable practices that are threatening wildlife. We'd also like to see more enforcement of labelling, making it clear which products contain palm oil and whether it's sustainable, so that it's easier for the public to make more sustainable choices. And we use dissemination of information and practical tools like prompts and public commitments, particularly for those groups we work with who are already motivated. Quite often information is the bit that is missing for them. But a lot of our success and some of the examples I want to give today are using some of those other levers, particularly social influences, building social norms, and starting with emotional connections. And that's particularly true on our communities work and our work with schools. So one of our recent projects showing how we can leverage support from across the world through our Zoo network is our work on the Palm Oil app, where we were able to launch it in the UK alongside colleagues in the USA and Canada, launching it over there. And this really is a tool for people to be able to choose more sustainable products by scanning them in as they're shopping. And as they scan, if those products aren't in the database, we're able to look them up, check that company's policy and add them so that more and more people are able to use this tool. Another aspect of this work is our Sustainable Palm Oil Communities work, a behaviour change campaign focused on the food hospitality industry. And Chester became the first sustainable palm oil city in the world in 2019. And this is very much a project that relies on social influences and on creating a social norm for a city around sustainable palm oil. So in order to become a sustainable palm oil city, using the Sustainable Fish Cities model, we needed to get champions from each of these categories. And a champion needed to commit to being part of the programme, make a change in one of their products, and then make a public statement about their commitment to using only sustainable palm oil and sharing their policy on this. And we have members in the category 1 who are restaurants, catering in companies, leisure and visitor attractions, education providers, and manufacturers based in our city. And through this public pledge process, making that commitment public, but also putting pressure upwards onto the supply chain. As suppliers working with many of these organisations, it's much easier for them to switch to sustainable because that's what's being demanded by the companies they work with. Our first restaurant, Chez Jules, was an individual restaurateur very motivated by emotional connections and what he'd seen travelling in Indonesia in terms of the impact of unsustainable palm oil. And he really helped us to create a social norm in the community and being an advocate. We were able to get major catering companies like Essential, who provide 5 million school meals, and they've become the world's first certified school catering company. We're now doing a similar thing with the national caterers that work with University of Chester. So the project is beginning to have ripples outside of Chester. It's also being picked up by other communities at varying scale, supported by us, so we're able to provide the tools, the basis, some of which we learned through our own procurement, So by auditing our own supply chain, we can provide lists of sustainable products that can be used by others. And in each of these areas, there's a champion lead, whether it's a zoo, an aquarium, conservation organisation, or in one case, a local primary school. And this work has become very much linked with our work with schools, taking us beyond education, but really championing the involvement of young people in decision-making about what happens in their communities. And our collaboration with schools is really wide-ranging, working with teachers to map across their curriculum, but also to use pedagogical approaches and teaching that is based on drama and storytelling, and really enables young people to create an emotional connection, one that then goes far beyond their lessons and is much more about the change that they want to see in the world. We have here a quote from one of our teachers. So the demand from children led them to change their catering supplier. They also wrote to local bakeries and wrote to politicians. So we're very much connected to that policy work, and thinking back to that kind of supply chain diagram that I showed, showing how each of these projects is connected as we start to use social influences and demand from people for change that they want to see. So how does this all link to the Global Biodiversity Framework? I think it's clear the work that I've outlined really links to Target 16 and encouraging people and enabling people to make sustainable consumption choices, either by framing those choices, by creating social influences and norms, using emotional connections, or providing information and tools and some of the structures that are needed to help people make informed choices. And this is work that we're continuing. And we use similar frameworks and similar behaviour change levers across other aspects of our work that are relevant to the other targets. So thank you. I'm now going to pass over to my colleague Simon Dowell, who's going to talk us through the Q&A. I think we also have an audience poll now.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Hello, everybody. My name is Simon Dowell. I'm the Conservation Science and Policy Director at Chester Zoo. As Charlotte said, we're absolutely delighted to be co-hosting this webinar with RARE. We've worked with RARE, as was discussed earlier, on the motion to the IUCN, motion 64, which encouraged people to use behaviour-centred design in their project design. And it's been a wonderful journey working with wonderful colleagues on this really important subject. So I'm absolutely delighted to be participating in the webinar today. As Charlotte says, I think we have a poll that we want to do. I'm hoping Sam's going to help me with this, because I think we've got a poll for, there we go. Right, thank you very much, Sam. What we wanted to do before we start the Q&A is just get some information from you, because it's really important that we understand what we can do next. We want this webinar to be the start of a lot more activity towards achieving the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So if you wouldn't mind just answering this question for us, and you can see there are 4 options, and I think you can select as many as you want. And then we can get an idea of which of these things might be the most helpful to you for bringing your behaviour change work to life. So we'll just pause for a few moments while people do that, and then we can have a look at the results. Okay, I wonder if we've got some results we can share yet, Sam? That's wonderful, thank you. Okay, well, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. If we were going to have a competition between these 4 things, it would be very close, but it obviously isn't a competition. We've got support for all of those areas in roughly equal measure. So these are all things: practical guidance, written case studies, training, and wider networks, I think, are all things people are going to find useful. So that is incredibly helpful. Thank you very much indeed for that. So now we're going to have a Q&A, and I'd like to thank the speakers for some really excellent presentations. I've learned a tremendous amount this afternoon already. I'm hoping to learn a bit more from the questions. We've had some great questions come in. We won't have time, unfortunately, to answer them all online this afternoon, but we'll try and get some of them answered later on if your questions are covered. But I'm going to start with one for David. So David gave us an excellent introduction to the GBF and helpfully summarised it for us and talked particularly about implementation. And a question that we have for you, David, is that Section K seems to prioritise raising awareness and communication as the main methods to promote behaviour change. However, does the framework account for barriers other than lack of awareness to behaviour change? For instance, in a recent paper in Science, showed that Exxon had been well aware of its climate impact for several decades, but hasn't changed its behaviour because of its financial dependency on fossil fuels. Over to you, David.
Great, thanks very much. And thank you very much for the question. So I think it's important to understand that the annexes to the framework, so once you get past the goals, once you get past the action targets, you get to the other mechanisms, is these are the variety of tools that are needed to facilitate the transformational change we need to achieve the framework. It's true that Section K focuses very heavily on awareness, and that's under the convention process. That seems to be sort of a path dependency or direction that we've taken, where most of the parties focus on awareness raising. So that section does look at it. However, I was struck when I looked at the presentation by Charlotte, the work that Chester Do has done there, that it shows that facilitating behavior change does potentially include, and almost always starts with, some form of awareness raising, but it's not sufficient. So I think it's necessary, but absolutely not sufficient. So I think the important part is to look at the other targets and identify that with awareness raising, that you can sort of, look at ways of identifying paths forward, get a sense of people's awareness of the environmental challenges around them, deal with some of the barriers. That's only part of it. I mean, I think the other part has to be looking at, how can we accommodate some of these other matters? So that'll be look at some of the things that we learned when we looked at the presentation by Rosina, for example, looking at, in that particular model of behavior change, what are all the different elements going forward? So I'm a fan, and I've done work for my career on awareness raising for years and years and years, but I've always been aware that it's only one of the parts of things that's part of an overall pattern. So we do have to be aware that we don't fall into the trap that raising awareness is sufficient. Thanks.
Very much, David. That's really helpful. I have another question here, which is sort of a statement, but I think raises an important point that I can perhaps address to Kevin. This is that behaviour change is essential to achieve goals, but it assumes that the changer has the answers as to what needs to be done. It seems a bit top-down when one culture has goals that need to be met by other cultures. Needs are different in different cultures. So I wonder if, Kevin, you'd be willing to comment on that.
Sure. Thanks, Simon, and thanks for the comment. I think the short sort of comment that I would make on top of it is I agree, and I think it speaks to the importance of when we talk about people-centered solutions or behavior-centered solutions, we clarify what people and what behaviors, and look for opportunities where there are shared goals, shared aspirations, and the process is co-design. So a good example of that is some of what Rocky was sharing in Fish Forever, where there is support to pursue shared goals and find those synergies, rather than assume it's an approach that one person is the changer and one actor is the changer and one actor is the changed. Obviously, a ton more to say about that and dig into what that actually looks like. But I think it's a great comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Rosina, I've got a question for you. From your perspective, what support might be needed to help parties and implementers to embed the principles from behaviour change into their work?
In brief, I guess I would say maybe three things. One would be support for project development, particularly for defining comprehensively the problem and who needs to be involved with consideration of the social factors, the culture, the norms, the power dynamics in the design of the theory of change. Second, I would say we need support to have those stakeholder engagement processes that are explicit about whose behavior can have what effects. And then third, and one that's very hard with often multilateral development projects, is support for continuous stakeholder consultations that you can encourage that iterative learning about environmental management and social change. So sometimes the 3 to 5 year project cycles, don't allow to build those deep connections. So help in project development, continuous stakeholder consultations, and actually support to do the stakeholder engagement right would be my 3 quick answers to you.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Rosina. I think that helps us as we look to follow up on this webinar and support people in this work. Rocky, you gave a fantastic presentation and referenced the role of behaviour change in the Coastal Marine Ecosystems Management Programme. What role do you think governments can play in supporting behaviour change approaches of the type that you've been involved in? Because I know you've had some good engagement with the government there in the Philippines.
Yeah, I think what we've been trying to do in working with the Philippines government is really helping different staff from the government at different levels really appreciate the role of behavior change in the process. I think one critical thing that's always been an aha moment for a lot of them is really just the exercise of putting themselves in the shoes of the audiences and really empathizing and understanding what it is that people are believe or what their motivations are. And that already changes, because when you're in government, you really tend to think in terms of programs and projects that you have to implement and kind of like your indicators. And I think it's really worth encouraging a step back to just kind of like think about the people that you're trying to support and really how they see it from that point of view. And I think in most cases, as we've done that, our partners have really appreciated getting the chance to do that and are excited by it.
Thanks, Rocky. That's great advice. And I'm sure there are people listening who will be able to use that. That's brilliant. Question for Charlotte now. Actually, this might be answered by others later, but this is for you to start with, Charlotte. What advice would you give people joining today who are looking to ensure awareness raising campaigns actually translate into real world action?
I think it probably is summed up by a lot of what we've been talking about, and that is about using behavioural science and not assuming, and also that thing about co-production and involving the people that you want to work with, not assuming that you know what the barriers are. I think sometimes awareness raising leads because we assume that the gap is around knowledge, and actually there can be many more barriers to taking behaviours. Sometimes knowledge is there. It's not that awareness raising is what's even needed. It may be motivation, it may be practical tools, it may be something different. So I think really defining the behaviour that wants to be changed, thinking about who ideally needs to take that behaviour change, and then working with them, working with people to consider what the best solutions are, rather than awareness raising, I think, always implies a one-way communication of what needs to be done, rather than a very genuine engagement and at least a two-way process, probably a multi-way process with lots of stakeholders.
Thanks, Charlotte. That's really helpful. I've got some questions now. I say questions, I think we're running out of time, but there's one in particular I want to ask for anybody to answer. Communities are at the forefront and centre of all your behaviour change efforts. What enabling conditions or basic conditions do the presenters look for in a community before moving forward with a project that incorporates behaviour change? Would anybody like to come in on that one? Might be one for you, Rocky, actually, the work you're doing there in the Philippines.
Yeah, I can take a first pass. I think we do look for communities where there is a certain level of, not necessarily cohesion, because we do try to build that, but it's very difficult to do this when there are other kind of like overriding issues that are very divisive, and it's just hard to bring people together to at least go through that process of change that we're describing. So we've had experiences, for example, in some communities where the election was very fraught and very divisive, and therefore there were a lot of factions to start with, and it just felt like every conversation would devolve into that. So we can kind of avoid that, and we do look for signals of willingness to change, or at least an interest in kind of like moving forward. So other than speaking with the local leaders, we do some informal conversations with communities even before we agree to come in and support the process.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Would anybody else like to give a brief answer to that question before we finish? I think we're very short of time, unfortunately, anyway. So we've had many more questions. I'm really sorry if your question wasn't answered on the call today. We will endeavour to provide some written and thank you ever so much for submitting your questions. And I'd just like to thank the speakers for their excellent contributions and the answers to the questions and for enlightening us so well as to their work on behaviour change. So I'm going to now hand back to Sam, who's going to make some final remarks and point us towards some resources to enable us to follow up.
Thank you, Simon. And once again, thank you for all our speakers and everyone else for joining us here today as well. So as Simon said, that brings us to the end of today's session. So I want to quickly point a few little takeaways that I think could be super helpful for all of you as we go away from the end of today. So the first is our behaviour change resource platform, behaviour.rare.org. So there's going to be, and there is, a lot of materials, resources, tools that will be really helpful for you as you begin to think about and reflect on today's conversations in regards to how behaviour change can help with implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So it's a great platform to get resources and ideas that can help inspire your work. And additionally, through the poll, you'll notice as well that one of the things that came up that a lot of you were looking for was additional trainings and learning that can help apply behaviour change theory and behavioural change insights to your work. So one thing that I wanted to shamelessly plug was some upcoming training that we're running. So we have both an online self-paced course and also a 3-day virtual training, which is a great way to learn more about what we call principles from behaviour-centred design. And I think this will be really helpful for those of you that are wanting to begin to apply those principles to your work. And I believe the next training coming up is at the end of April, from April 25th to April 27th. But we can post a link to those resources as well in the chat. And then the final plug as well from my side today was to keep in touch with us. And I think one of the easiest ways to do that is, if you're not already subscribed, do register for our monthly newsletter, which is called Behaviour Beat. And that will be a really great way for all of you to keep up to date with events like this and other opportunities to connect and discuss and share resources around the topic of behaviour change. So that brings us very much to the end of today's session. Once again, a big thank you to all of you for joining us and all of our speakers who, of course, provided us with a lot of really interesting insights today. Anyway, thank you and goodbye.